Welcome, Chris Carr and Harold Kim.
Hello, everyone. As you can tell by the picture above here, or to the side of me, I'm Harold Kim, Chief Operating Officer at the Institute for Legal Reform. And we're very fortunate to have with us today the Chief Law Enforcement Officer from the great state of Georgia. Let me tell you a little bit about Chris. Chris is the 54th Attorney General of the state, but he does have a diverse background. You practiced law a little bit. You went in-house, I think you were with Georgia Pacific.
Not in the law department. I was in the structural panels division, Harold, Building America.
Wow.
That's what we did.
We got to know each other working on the Hill because you were Chief of Staff to Senator Isaacson while I was on the committee, and it's great to see your career develop. What I thought was really interesting about your background is that not only is Chris here a Johnny Cash fan, as you can tell by his black suit, but he is a die-hard Metallica fan.
Huge Metallica fan.
So that's going to tell you something about Chris.
Harold said that was going to be my entrance music, was going to be Enter Sandman, but I guess we didn't get it in. Thank you for whoever's clapping. Thank you.
So Chris, throughout the day, we've heard a lot about what's happening here in Washington, what's happening in the Beltway. We heard from Representative Rogers, we've heard from the Commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission about federal legislation, and we've heard stories about importance of preemption and the balkanization of this patchwork of laws that are happening at the state level. And so, how to hit that balance is definitely one aspect of this discussion, given that you are fully embedded in the state of Georgia. So why don't we start out by at least getting your viewpoints in terms of how do the states fit in when it comes to this entire data security as well as data privacy debate that's happening all across the country and probably globally as well.
Well, Harold, let me start and say thanks to the Chamber and ILR for all that y'all do to support business working in both the public policy as well as the legal realm, and I really do appreciate all that y'all do. Obviously, the issue of data privacy, data security is an issue that is going to be in front of us as far as the eye can see. And one of the things that we have, in Georgia, we've been very fortunate. We've created an environment. We're very proud of it. We were the #1 state in the nation in which to do business 6 years running. And fortunately, when I was at economic development, there were 3 years that we were doing that as well. And what we tried to do is we tried to work with the private sector to solve problems. One of the big areas that we've seen expansion in Georgia is in health IT and cyber, entertainment, mobility, you name it. And the thing that I have seen, and we had dealt with a little bit of legislation in Georgia a couple of years ago on cybersecurity. And it's clear to me that when you are looking at issues of national security or interstate commerce, we need the federal government to take the lead. That is the proper role of the federal government. You will see the traditional role, I think, of the states and an interest that the states have in law enforcement and in consumer protection. So obviously, if a crime has been committed against the people of our state, then we have an interest in that. Where you have misleading or deceptive practices, and I'm pro-business, but there's nothing pro-business about deceiving somebody, both in a consumer or a company doing it the right way, then I think you're going to see the states have that interest. So there is, I think, tension as far as that goes. When there are data breaches, where do you go at the federal level to report that? You don't want 12 or 15 different agencies, and you don't want to have to go to 50 different states. But I think that there is an interest in, if there is a critical mass of folks that have been impacted, you'll see a state, like an AG's office, again, that's our traditional role, whether that's a percentage of the population or raw numbers, whatever it may be. But that's the good conversation I think that needs to be had, because we have an interest in protecting consumers and companies, like I said, that do it the right way.
Well, we talked about this a little bit in the back, and that is how at the federal level, the Federal Trade Commission has its ability to enforce consumer protection laws, and then they have all throughout the states mini FTC laws. And one of the problems, I'm just going to call it piling on, is that businesses usually see a federal investigation, enforcement action being brought on the same set of facts that 4 or 5 states are bringing. And so there really isn't a whole lot of uniform enforcement.
Right.
And so traditionally there would be at least some discretion and restraint to figure out where the equities are. But when you have these competing laws without appropriate preemption, it does create a lot of confusion within the business community. A lot of people here who are representatives of the business community, I'm sure will tell you, how do you comply with this stuff?
Right.
Because it is a patchwork, it is a balkanization, and when you're constantly committing resources to compliance, that becomes a real strain on the business engine of this country.
Well, and confusion is bad for business.
Right.
Now, I'll hear from companies all the time, at least just tell me what the rules are, and we will make sure that we follow them. You know, I think that, you know, consistency, reliability, and predictability is key. There are times where some states work better with federal partners like the FTC and others. Right. There are times where you're going to be in conflict. One of the things that I learned at being the Commissioner of Economic Development in the state is, and I think I have a little bit unique perspective as it relates to AGs, because a lot of AGs either were prosecutors or came from private practice, and those are critically important skill sets. But having been Commissioner of Economic Development, I spent all day, every day trying to figure out how a company did business so that we could figure out the next dollar of investment, that next job. Well, the same thing I think is true as it relates to actions. You know, our job is to uphold the laws that are passed by our legislature, and there are times where we'll compete with the federal government where there's no preemption. It's our job to uphold those laws. If the law needs to be changed, that's somebody else's job. However, part of justice being done is the fair application of that law. So that goes back to restraint. Does it make sense for the state to be here? Does it make sense for the federal government to take the lead? And the hardest thing in the world, I think, is sometimes to get people to come together, either to restraint on the part of the agency or looking at solving the problem a little bit more uniquely, which is don't file an action, bring somebody to the table and let's talk through that first. And that's a little bit of a challenge.
Well, look, I think the country would do well and the business community would be receptive if there were 49 other AGs who shared your viewpoints in terms of restraint and enforcement and understanding that balance between federal and state relations, especially in the context of preemption. But one element I want to add to this discussion about the states, we do talk about the states, but there is a disturbing development in the area of cities and counties now getting into the mix of bringing litigation under contingency fee arrangements. We certainly see it with opioid litigation,
right,
mortgage lending. We're very concerned that this can explode onto the scene in the data privacy arena. And what does that mean when you have thousands of potential plaintiffs fueled by contingency fee-driven lawyers, and where does that put you as the chief law enforcement officer, chief legal officer in a state like Georgia?
Well, that's right, and Harold, this is a challenge that, as you mentioned, we have right now. What I've tried to remind the leadership at Georgia's city and county level is this: remember, your constituents are also my constituents. And we have that traditional interest, again, where there is a consumer protection piece involved. That is the job of the AG and the state to make sure that we come and properly handle that. When you start dividing up us versus them, that's a false argument.
Right.
It's us and us. But what has happened, and I've seen it just directly with the opioid litigation, is firms have gone to the cities and the counties and said, look, you got left out of tobacco. Don't get left out of opioids. And by the way, we're going to do a contingency fee, so it's not going to cost you a dime. So you've got mayors and county commissioners who are saying to themselves from a political perspective, why would I not do this?
It's free money, right?
It's, in air quotes, free money. So that's the challenge. But at the end of the day, again, most of the claims really can't be brought by cities and counties. I've encouraged mayors and county commissioners to look at the legal arguments. Sometimes, the claims that are brought are oftentimes the ones that the state should bring.
Yep.
So it is a challenge. You are seeing that more and more coming as a business development thing, going to the cities and counties and saying, don't get left out this time.
Yeah. Well, we're encouraged by the fact that there are certain states like Texas this year that's trying to rein in the proliferation of this municipality litigation, and hopefully that becomes a model for other states to follow, because I can only see chaos when you have so many cooks in the kitchen trying to resolve a national litigation crisis.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, and look at the state of Georgia. We have 159 counties.
Right.
Because in Georgia, we have always traditionally we've been very hesitant about centralized government. So we have 159 counties, 159 sheriffs, DAs are all constitutionally protected. So that becomes even more and more of a challenge, because They don't report up through us. They are independent in and of themselves, so you've got to be able to have a good working relationship as that goes.
So look, I think we're all realistic that, you know, the state AGs have a role here. And as Washington tries to wade through the policy battles when it comes to data privacy and security, I think what would be helpful for a lot of people in this room is if you have any words of wisdom, any advice, because you have representatives from business here, when dealing with the state attorneys general community, because you have very good relationships on both sides of the aisle and someone who is viewed as a leader in the community. So what would you recommend these folks do?
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate it. And Harold mentioned he and I both served on the Hill together. You know, the thing that I have observed, I worked with Senator Johnny Isakson for 11 years. I was chief of staff for 6. And so that was from 04 to 13. And what has happened over that time frame and till now is Congress has gotten less and less done. And that's with all due respect to anybody who's there, but Congress gets less done, and nature abhors a vacuum. That vacuum is either being filled by the federal executive or by the states. So you're seeing state AGs as well as governors getting more and more involved. And there is a difference in philosophy amongst not just parties, but different states and how each state crafts an AG's office differently. But it's like when we worked on the Hill, and it's like a lot of folks in this audience understand, it is far better to have a relationship with the state AG before there is a crisis than at the 11th hour and you're trying to get something done. And it's, again, I go back to this economic development. You know, again, my job was to get to know companies, and we were in people's offices and at their plants. We're getting to know how we as the state could help companies succeed and grow and expand. But I get in the AG world, and there's a lot of arm's length. It's like, well, wait a minute, we don't want the regulator getting into our business.
Right.
That seems like a bad idea. I would disagree. I think that you are seeing more state AGs getting involved in more and more issues, not just at the state level, but at the federal level as well. I would strongly encourage the companies and the folks in this room, please get to know the state AGs, both from, you know, there's, I think, an offensive and a defensive position. And the more, as I said before, I think from a justice perspective, the fair application of the law only comes when we know what you do. And that is very helpful to us. And if there is a crisis, and if something does happen, it is far better to have those relationships than not.
So how do they do that? You have a cell phone number you can share with folks here?
404-450-0801. Just tell everybody enjoy. Right? I gave you all my cell number, okay?
Well, tell me a little bit about your office. I mean, the fact that you practice law, you're up on the Hill, now I'm sure you're managing a ton of attorneys, consumer protection, criminal, civil litigation. And what kind of viewpoint do you bring to your office, given your background from policy to litigation and everything under the sun?
Well, and I appreciate it. It has been, it's been fascinating. It's been a great experience, 2.5 years. Absolutely love it. You know, I've always said that it's my duty to defend the Constitution of the United States, the Constitution and laws of the state of Georgia, and to represent the interests of the people of Georgia, and that also includes the corporate interests. So having been on the Hill, seen the federal issues that we had to deal with and have been dealing with, having seen it from the business perspective, and now in the role that we play, you know, day to day, we're the lawyer, and each state, as I mentioned before, does it differently. But we're the lawyers for the executive branch of state government. So all the agencies, boards, and the authorities that comprise state government, we're the lawyers for, but we really report and we are responsible to the people of Georgia. And so that means we get involved in a number of different issues, and we've tried to identify a few policy issues that make sense for our state and for us. And that includes human trafficking and opioid addiction, elder abuse, cyber crimes, gang activity, openness and transparency in government, and economic development. Because again, going back, one of the reasons companies locate in Georgia is because they know that they get a fair shake, and not every state sees it that way and has a pro-business approach, but we do. And having a reliable, predictable, and consistent legal and regulatory environment is part of that. And companies know that when you locate in a state, something's going to come up. You want to know that you at least have somebody that you can go deal with and talk with. Yep. And we've done that as well. And so each office does it a little bit differently. But as I mentioned, state AGs are getting more and more involved in federal issues, whether it's healthcare, environmental issues, immigration, you name it. So having that experience on the Hill, having dealt with those issues, I think has been invaluable.
Good stuff, good stuff. Let's switch topics here a little bit. I think it was late last year, maybe in December or so, the state of Ohio did something relatively innovative, and that was to create a compliance defense or a safe harbor for companies who have good security measures, and if there is a breach, the company would not be held liable for civil or other types of penalties because of that breach from a litigation perspective specifically. And it's similar to what we're seeing happening even here in Washington with the Department of Justice really focusing on a carrot approach as opposed to a stick approach, and that is to incentivize compliance.
Yeah.
And if you incentivize it by telling a company, hey, you may not have liability if you have good systems in place, that might be a good solution to this enforcement puzzle that we have. So talk to me a little bit about your viewpoints on that and whether that is something achievable in a place like Georgia or in other states.
Well, I think it makes a ton of sense, particularly from a policy perspective, incentivizing good behavior,
Right.
Incentivizing best practices. And the Georgia Chamber of Commerce actually brought this up. Our legislative session is 40 days at the beginning of each year, and brought this up and has initially kind of put forth this conversation. So I know it's of interest to the business community in Georgia. But again, incentivizing and finding ways that we can encourage folks to do it the right way, and then say, if you did it that way, then you get some protection. Dovetailing back into our office, we've tried to take that approach as well, and from a consumer protection standpoint, focusing on good training and education and awareness for small businesses, houses of worship, and nonprofits. And we're tapping into some of the great expertise in these companies like an NCR, WorldPay, some of the fintech companies that we have, saying, all right, you guys have great infrastructure, great best practices. How can we work and take that to the small business level, to the house of worship, and not where it could be existential if something occurs? And so we're trying to focus more on that, on the education and the training piece, because we know that is a key part of any established standards as it relates to data privacy and security, is making sure that you have good training in place. You can have all the infrastructure and technology you want, but if employees aren't also abiding by it, if you don't have good policy. So I think incentivizing that is good policy to encourage to do it that way.
Well, I guess the tricky issue is extending that to the area of privacy, because it certainly works when you're talking about data breach cybersecurity, because there's usually a third-party actor doing something bad that wasn't really in your control, and you did everything in your power to keep a system in place. But when it comes to the broader issues of collection, use, handling, transparency, all of these issues, well, how do you build a compliance regimen based on that? And I think that could be something that the business community should look at as a possibility. And what are the policy outcomes that flow from that?
I completely agree, and be at the table for the business community. Stay at the table for these conversations, because if you're not at the table, you are not at the table in this whole sort of thing.
Actually, if you're not at the table, I think I heard Tom Donahue say you're on the menu. So
Yeah, there you go. That's exactly right. But again, we sat down and we talked to some of the Fortune 500 companies in Georgia. Said, all right, what are you doing in this space? It's on the security side as well as the privacy side, and talk about ways we can get that into the conversation as it relates to all Georgia businesses.
Right.
Same thing has to go from a public policy perspective here, making sure. And again, the approach the chamber has taken, which is transparency and opt out and data deletion, that sort, allowing the consumer to have control over their data, I think is critically important. And companies that are doing it the right way have embraced that from everything that I can see. And the fact that Ohio has implemented that, Georgia is looking at it, it is now starting to get into the discussion, and the chamber's pushed it as well. So I think that's important, to be at the table both at the state and the federal levels.
Yeah. Well, Justice Brandeis famously once said that the states are the laboratories of democracy.
That's right.
And when it comes to the data privacy policy debate, certainly the states have been out in front, and it seems like the federal government is catching up. One of the things that ILR, because we do care about liability and risk and litigation, basically what the trial lawyers are doing, as you've heard from Representative Rogers and also hints from Commissioner Phillips, deals with something we call private rights of action, or PRAs. And I've talked about this in the past, and basically these are legislative grants to sue based on a violation of a particular standard, and it's particularly pernicious in places like Illinois. They have a Biometric Privacy Act, Telephone Consumer Protection Act at the federal level. These have been engines for class action litigation. And surprise, surprise, the California law, the privacy law, at least on the cyber side, has a private right of action, where everyday California citizens who have suffered a breach could collect statutory damages, and that could accumulate pretty quickly,
right,
depending on a particular incident. And so, we've been very vocal to try and encourage policymakers here in Washington as well as in the states to really not pursue this type of outcome. I'm going to give a plug here, so I'm just very quickly. We did release research on this today, and it was written by Mark Brennan, who is a partner at Hogan Lovells. This talks about the bad history of PRAs and hopefully a tool that could be used for policymakers as they consider some of these boneheaded ideas, because all it does is drive litigation, and that's the last thing we necessarily need, at least from my vantage point. But what say you on
I agree.
Like
Yeah, from a policy perspective, that's not my preference. Number one, as I said before, part of the traditional role that the attorney generals in the state play is, again, consumer protection. And by going down the PRA path, you are farming that out, right, your responsibility out to somebody else, number one. Number two, you mentioned of the laboratory, each state being kind of the laboratory for innovation. Well, from a business perspective, I think that that's critically important. Again, the balance that we have at the state level is to protect consumers and companies that do it the right way.
Right.
So we need to make sure that the law is followed, right? But you also want to create an environment where there's innovation.
Yep.
You mentioned in the podcast about Illinois not allowing the Ring technology because of facial recognition. Well, again, to me, that's going in the wrong direction. We take pride in the fact that we want our state to tap into the great research that's being done at Georgia Tech or the University of Georgia, Emory, whatever it may be. So you've got to be able to balance those two out. In addition, I worry that justice is not served, at least not served quickly, when you start having more and more lawsuits that get filed individually rather than looking at it from a policy perspective. And so, and I mean, we're seeing it again, I think, again, with the opioid litigation. It's not getting less complicated, it's getting more complicated. So I would suggest that, again, that is the duty and the function of our offices as it relates to consumer protection, is to make sure that we protect the interests of the consumers and companies that do it in the state, not farm it out.
You think you could talk to the Attorney General of California, because I understand that his entire, well, one of his policy platforms as they tried to amend the CCPA was to extend the private right of action for the privacy piece of things. And I think his argument came something akin to, well, we just don't have the resources to do this, so let's outsource it.
Right.
So can you talk to him?
Harold, you silver-tongued devil, I'm sure you can handle that just fine.
I don't know if you would take a meeting with me.
You know, and again, you know, there are, again, the law in Georgia allows for False Claims Act type issues and that sort of thing.
Right.
But again, if you're talking about policy preferences kind of going forward, the preference would, again, I think that's the duty of our offices.
Yep.
And then it's our office's responsibility also to make sure that we can go to the legislature and have the resources needed as well. No, those are challenges. I can appreciate all that. But from a policy perspective, that's what we're supposed to be doing.
All right, last question.
Yes, sir.
Favorite Metallica song?
Oh, my God. Hardest question of the day.
You did mention Enter Sandman.
Yeah, I did. I like the Black Album. I'm not going to lie to you. But Ride the Lightning, fantastic. Fade to Black. Anything that they're playing is pretty much fantastic.
All right. Well, let's go back there and listen to some music.
I love it.
Please join me in welcoming and thanking the Attorney General, Chris Carr.
Thank y'all. Appreciate it.